The air at Fort Bragg hung thick and heavy, like a wet wool blanket you couldn't throw off. It was the kind of late summer heat in North Carolina that made you sweat in places you didn't know you had. For the soldiers of Alpha Company, 3rd Platoon, it was just another day of being pushed to the breaking point. This was their final field exercise before deployment, the last test before they traded these familiar pine forests for the dust and mountains of a foreign land. Sergeant Eva Rostova stood beside a Humvee, her eyes scanning the faces of her squad. They were tired. Their uniforms were stained with sweat and dirt, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and gritty resolve. Eva was tired, too, but she didn't let it show. She couldn't afford to. At 5'5", with a lean, wiry frame, she was physically smaller than every man in her squad, a fact that some of them never let her forget. Her gaze settled on Specialist Henderson, a man built like a refrigerator who everyone called Hulk. He was leaning against a tree, trying to look casual, but his eyes were fixed on their platoon's senior NCO, First Sergeant Marcus Thorne. Thorne was holding court near the command tent, his voice a low rumble that carried across the clearing. Thorne was a man carved from old hickory and stubborn pride. He'd been in the army for 20 years, and he believed in two things: tradition and grit. In his eyes, Eva Rostova was short on both. He saw her meticulous planning not as a strength, but as a sign of hesitation. He saw her quiet, steady demeanor, not as professionalism, but as a lack of the fiery aggression he believed a leader needed. And though he never said it outright, his tone and his dismissive glances made it clear he thought a woman had no place leading men into combat. "Listen up," Thorne's voice boomed, silencing the low chatter. The platoon gathered around him, the clink of their gear a familiar chorus. Eva moved her squad into formation, her posture ramrod straight. She could feel Thorne's eyes on her, and she braced herself. It was coming. Thorne unrolled a map on the hood of his Humvee. "We've got one last objective for this exercise," he announced, his finger stabbing at a point on the map. "It's a simulated enemy communications outpost, located on top of Ridge 22. It's a tough climb, thick woods, and intel says the area is heavily fortified." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "This is a full squad mission. First squad, you're on point. Second squad, you'll provide overwatch from the south." He looked around, a smirk playing on his lips. "And third squad," he said, his eyes locking onto Eva, "you get the honor of being our decoy." A few of the men chuckled. Being the decoy was never an honor. It meant making a lot of noise, drawing a lot of attention, and taking a lot of simulated fire. It was the grunt work, designed to let another team get the glory. "Your objective," Thorne continued, his voice dripping with false enthusiasm, "is to approach from the west, through the swamp. Make a big scene, let them know you're coming. We need you to pull their main force in your direction so first squad can slip in from the east and take out the objective." Ava's jaw tightened, but her face remained a mask of calm. The swamp, it was the most difficult, most miserable route to the ridge. It was a place of thick mud, tangled roots, and swarms of biting insects. It would slow them down, exhaust them, and make them a perfect, slow-moving target. He was setting her up to fail. "You'll have limited resources," Thorne added, as if an afterthought. "One radio, standard ammo load, no extra support. We need you to look like a small, isolated patrol that's gotten lost." He folded the map with a sharp snap. "Any questions, Sergeant Rostova?" The question was a challenge, not an invitation. He was daring her to complain, to argue, to show weakness. "No, First Sergeant," Eva said, her voice even and clear. "Third squad understands the mission." "Good," Thorne grunted. "Get your men ready. You move out in 30. As the platoon dispersed, Hulk Henderson sauntered over to Ava's squad, a wide grin on his face. "The swamp, huh, Sarge? Guess the first sergeant wants to see if you're scared of getting your boots muddy." Eva ignored him, turning to her men. "All right, you heard him. Let's get our gear checked. Martinez, make sure the radio has fresh batteries. Santiago, double-check your medical kit. We're going into thick territory. I want everyone to have extra water and bug repellent." Let's move. Her squad, for the most part, respected her. They had seen her outshoot, outrun, and outthink most of the NCOs in the platoon. They knew her quietness was just focus. The constant chipping away from Thorne and his followers like Hulk was starting to wear on them. They exchanged uneasy glances, but they did as they were told. The only one who met her eyes with open support was Specialist Rico Santiago, the squad's medic. Everyone called him Doc. He was a calm, wiry man from San Antonio who had a knack for seeing things other people missed. "He's riding you hard," Eva Doc said quietly as he repacked his medical bag. He's testing the platoon. Doc, Eva replied, not wanting to admit how personal it felt. That's his job. No, Doc said, shaking his head. That's not what this is. This is him trying to prove a point. Just be careful. The swamp is no joke. Exercise or not will be fine, Eva said, her voice more confident than she felt. We stick to our training, we communicate, and we watch each other's backs. That's all we can do. An hour later, 3rd Squad was deep in the swamp. The air was still and smelled of decay and wet earth. Sunlight struggled to pierce the thick canopy of leaves overhead, casting the world in a gloomy, green twilight. Mud sucked at their boots with every step, making a sound like a hungry mouth. Mosquitoes whined in their ears, relentless. Eva was at the point, her M4 rifle held at the ready. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of awareness through her. Even though it was a training exercise with blank rounds, the instincts were the same. Complacency got you killed. How you holdin' up, Hulk? Martinez whispered from behind her. Just peachy, Henderson grumbled, swatting at a cloud of insects around his head. I think I've swallowed about a dozen of these things. This is ridiculous. 1st Squad is probably strolling through a nice, dry field right now. Quiet on the chatter, Eva ordered, her voice a low hiss. Sound travels in here. They pushed on for another hour, the mud getting deeper, the progress painfully slow. This was exactly what Thorne had intended. By the time they reached the base of the ridge, they would be exhausted, their focus dulled. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the swamp. It wasn't the sound of a blank round. It was sharper, more final. It was the sound of a tree branch breaking under a heavy weight. It was followed by a scream. Hold, Eva commanded, dropping to one knee and raising her rifle. The squad instantly fanned out, their training taking over. The scream came again. Choked with pain, it was from their left flank. It's Miller, someone yelled. I think he fell. Eva's mind raced. Procedure, assess, secure, act. Martinez, Hulk, with me. The rest of you, form a perimeter, face out. Watch our backs, she commanded. She pushed through the thick undergrowth, her heart pounding. She found Specialist Miller at the bottom of a small, muddy ravine. He had clearly slipped on the slick bank, and his leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. A jagged white bone protruded from the skin of his shin. It was a compound fracture. This was no longer a simulation, Doc. Eva yelled over her shoulder. Get up here now. Miller was pale, his face beaded with sweat, his teeth clenched in agony. Hulk Henderson stared down at the gruesome injury, his face turning a shade of green. Oh man, he breathed. Oh, that's bad. Doc Santiago slid down the muddy bank, his medical bag already open. He was all business. All right, Miller, don't look at it. Just breathe. We're gonna take care of you. Eva was on the radio. Alpha Command. This is 3rd Squad. We have a real-world medical emergency. I repeat, this is a real-world medevac. Request. The radio crackled. It was Thorne's voice. 3rd Squad. What's your status? Did you just break radio silence? 1st Sergeant, this is Rostova, Eva said, her voice tight with urgency. We have a soldier with a compound fracture. It's a serious injury. We need an immediate medevac. There was a pause. When Thorne spoke again, his voice was laced with suspicion. A compound fracture. Are you sure you're not being a little dramatic, Sergeant? Maybe he just twisted his ankle. Eva felt a surge of hot anger, but she pushed it down. 1st Sergeant, I am looking at the bone. It has broken the skin. He is in shock. We need to get him out of here now. This is highly irregular, Rostova, Thorne said, his voice cold. You're in the middle of a tactical movement. Popping a flare for a medevac is going to give away the entire platoon's position. You're compromising the mission for one soldier. This soldier's life is the mission right now. 1st Sergeant, Eva shot back, her control finally cracking. You get him stabilized and you get him to the extraction point on your own. Thorne ordered. That's 2 clicks north of your position. I'm not calling off this exercise for a sprained ankle. Thorne out. The radio went silent. Eva stared at the handset in disbelief. He had just condemned him. Carrying a man on a stretcher through 2 kilometers of thick swamp was nearly impossible. It would take hours, and with an open fracture like Miller's, the risk of infection was massive. He was putting Miller's life in danger to avoid a blemish on his training exercise report. She looked at Doc, who had heard the whole exchange. His face was grim. He's out of his mind, Doc whispered. Miller could lose his leg. He could die. Eva looked at the faces of her men. They were scared. They had trusted the system, trusted their leaders to have their backs. And the system had just failed them. She saw Hulk Henderson, the big talker, looking pale and uncertain. She saw Martinez, his eyes wide with fear. In that moment something inside Eva shifted. This was no longer about proving herself to Thorn. It was about saving her soldier. Her responsibility was to the men right here in this muddy, miserable swamp, not to some officer playing war games from a comfortable tent. She took a deep breath, her mind clearing, her focus narrowing to a single point. "All right," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority that cut through the fear. "Forget him. We have a new mission. We're getting Miller out of here." She turned to Hulk Henderson. "You and I are going to fashion a stretcher out of our ponchos and some branches. Find 2 thick straight ones, about 7 feet long." Now, Hulk, who had been frozen in place, blinked and then nodded, spurred into action by the certainty in her voice. "Martinez," Eva continued, "get back on that radio. Don't call Thorn. Go to the emergency channel. Broadcast in the blind if you have to. State our grid coordinates and the nature of the emergency. Tell them we are a non-tactical unit requesting immediate medical assistance. Use my authority. Do it every 5 minutes until you get a response. But Sarge, Thorn will." Martinez started. "I don't care what Thorn will do." Eva cut him off, her eyes like steel. "I am the ranking NCO on site, and I am responsible for the life of this soldier. That is a direct order, specialist." Martinez swallowed hard and nodded, his fingers already fumbling for the radio dial. Eva turned back to Doc Santiago. "Doc, you do what you need to do to keep him stable. Tell us what you need. We are your hands." Doc looked up at her, a flicker of profound respect in his eyes. He nodded. "Okay, we need to splint this, but we have to clean it first. I need all the sterile water we have. We need to keep him warm and we need to keep him conscious." For the next hour, 3rd Squad ceased to be a decoy unit. They became a rescue team. Under Ava's calm, precise direction, they worked together with a singular purpose. Hulk Henderson, his earlier mockery forgotten, used his immense strength to rip branches from trees. Martinez diligently sent out the distress call over and over. The other men offered their water, their field jackets, their quiet encouragement. Eva was everywhere. She helped Doc clean the wound, her stomach churning at the sight but her hands steady. She supervised the construction of the stretcher, ensuring the knots were tight and the frame was strong. She spoke to Miller in a low, calming voice, reassuring him, keeping the fear at bay. She had made a choice. She had defied a direct order from her superior officer. She had, in the eyes of First Sergeant Thorn, completely failed her mission. But as she looked at her men working together, their faces grim but determined, she knew she had made the only choice that mattered. She had chosen her soldier over the mission. Finally, Martinez's face lit up. "Sarge, I've got someone. It's not command, it's the airbase tower. They picked up our signal. They're asking if we can pop smoke to confirm our location." A wave of relief washed over Eva. "Tell them yes. Green smoke," she ordered. A moment later, a plume of thick, green smoke hissed into the humid air, climbing above the canopy. It was a beacon of hope, but it was also a flag of surrender in Thorn's wargame, a clear signal to everyone for miles that Sergeant Rostova had failed. She knew when she got back, Thorn would be waiting for her, his face a mask of thunder. She knew there would be a price to pay. But as she heard the distant, faint hump of an approaching helicopter, she looked down at Specialist Miller, whose eyes were now closed. His breathing shallow but steady. She knew she would pay that price, and any other, without a moment's hesitation. The real battle had just begun. The roar of the Black Hawk helicopter's rotors beat down on the small clearing, whipping leaves and swamp water into a frenzy. Eva Rostova and her squad shielded their faces as the flight medic and a crew chief skillfully loaded Specialist Miller, now strapped securely into a litter, into the waiting aircraft. Doc Santiago gave the flight medic a final, quick briefing, handing over a piece of paper with the vitals he'd been tracking. Eva watched the helicopter lift off, its dark shape rising above the treetops until it was just a speck in the hazy sky. The sound faded, replaced by the sudden, ringing silence of the swamp. For a moment, no one moved. The adrenaline that had fueled them for the past hour drained away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a heavy sense of dread. Miller was safe, but they were still in the swamp, and First Sergeant Thorn was still out there. Hulk Henderson was the first to speak, his voice low and completely stripped of its usual bravado. "Sarge," he said, looking at Eva, his eyes filled with a new, sober respect. "You did the right thing, no question." Martinez nodded in agreement, his face grim. Thorn was out of line. He left us high and dry. Eva looked at the faces of her men. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with something else. Loyalty. They weren't just her squad anymore, they were her team. They had faced a real crisis together, and she had not let them down. The mockery and the doubt had been washed away by the mud and the urgency of the moment. What's done is done, Eva said, her voice steady. Let's get our gear together. We're still 2 clicks from the extraction point. We need to move. There were no more complaints about the mud or the insects. The walk out of the swamp was quiet and purposeful. The men moved with a new efficiency, helping each other over tangled roots and through deep murky water. Hulk Henderson, who had once seemed to enjoy making things difficult for Eva, now stayed close, as if acting as an unofficial bodyguard. He'd seen what real leadership looked like, and it wasn't the loud, chest-thumping bravado of First Sergeant Thorne. It was the quiet, unshakable resolve of the small woman leading them out of the darkness. It took them another 90 minutes to reach the edge of the swamp. When they finally stepped onto solid, dry ground, they were met with an eerie silence. The sounds of the training exercise, the sporadic pop of blank fire, the shouts of other squads were gone. The woods were still. Something's not right, Doc Santiago said, scanning the tree line. The exercise should still be going on. Eva felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Martinez, get on the radio. Try to raise Alpha Command again. Martinez keyed the mic. Alpha Command, this is 3rd Squad. We have reached the extraction point. Over. The response was immediate, and it was Thorne's voice, cold as ice. Get your squad to the main command post on the double Rostova. The exercise has been terminated, and you and I are going to have a long talk. The knot in Ava's stomach turned to a block of ice. He had called off the entire exercise. The resources, the time, the effort of over 100 soldiers, all wasted. And he was going to lay the blame squarely at her feet. You heard him, Eva said to her squad. Let's go. The walk to the command post felt like a march to the gallows. When they emerged from the trees into the large clearing that served as the company's base of operations, they saw the entire platoon gathered. Men from 1st and 2nd Squad were sitting on the ground or leaning against vehicles, their expressions a mixture of confusion and irritation. They all turned to watch as 3rd Squad, covered in mud and grime, walked into the clearing, and there, standing in the center of it all, was First Sergeant Thorne. His face was a thundercloud, his jaw set so tight it looked like it might crack. He waited until Eva had brought her squad to a halt before he moved. He strode toward her, each step a hammer blow on the dry ground. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. He was a full foot taller than her, and he used his height to loom over her, trying to intimidate her. Sergeant Rostova, he began, his voice dangerously low, but loud enough for the entire platoon to hear. Do you have any idea what you've done? Eva stood her ground, her eyes locked on his. I saved the life of one of my soldiers, First Sergeant. Thorne let out a short, ugly laugh. You saved his life. You panicked. You couldn't handle the pressure, so you called for Mummy to come pick you up in a helicopter. You single-handedly compromised a company-wide training exercise that took weeks to plan and cost thousands of dollars. He turned to address the rest of the platoon. You see this? This is what happens when we lower our standards. This is what happens when we put people in charge who don't have the stomach for the realities of combat. An NCO is supposed to be able to tell the difference between a real crisis and a soldier who tripped and scraped his shin. It was a compound fracture, First Sergeant Eva said, her voice cutting through his tirade. It was calm, factual, and held no trace of fear. I don't care if his leg fell off, Thorne roared, his face turning a blotchy red. Your orders were to handle the situation internally and proceed with the mission. You directly disobeyed a lawful order from a superior officer. That's called insubordination, Sergeant. In a real combat zone, that's an offense that could get you court-martialed. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. You are a disgrace to this platoon. You are weak, you are emotional, and you have no business wearing those stripes. You have proven today that you are not fit to lead soldiers. I am officially recommending you for removal from your position. You will be stripped of your squad, and you will spend the rest of your time in this army pushing paper, where you can't hurt anyone. Eva didn't flinch. She stood there and took it, her expression unreadable. She knew that arguing with him here, in front of everyone, was pointless. He was playing to the crowd, trying to humiliate her, to break her. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. From the corner of her eye, she saw Hulk Henderson take a half-step forward, his hands clenched into fists. Doc Santiago put a hand on his arm, holding him back. The men of 3rd Squad were watching, their faces tight with anger. They knew the truth. They had been there. Are you finished? First Sergeant, Eva asked, her voice still unnervingly calm. Thorne's eyes widened in disbelief. He had expected tears, or excuses, or angry denials. He had not expected this quiet, unbreakable defiance. It enraged him even more. "No, I am not finished," he snarled. "Captain Evans wants to see you. Now he's in the command tent, and when I am done giving him my report, your career in this man's army is over." He turned his back on her, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. "Sergeant-at-Arms, take charge of 3rd Squad," he barked at another NCO. Eva gave her squad one last look. Doc Santiago gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. Hulk Henderson just stared at Thorne's back with pure hatred. She had their loyalty. That was the one thing Thorne couldn't take from her. She turned and walked toward the command tent, her back straight, her head held high. Every eye in the platoon was on her. She could feel their pity, their curiosity, their contempt, but she blocked it all out. She focused on putting one foot in front of the other. The command tent was surprisingly quiet after the scene outside. Captain Evans was sitting at a folding table, a laptop open in front of him. He was a man in his late 30s, with a serious, intelligent face and the weary eyes of a man who carried too much responsibility. He looked up as Eva entered, his expression unreadable. First Sergeant Thorne was already there, standing beside the table, still radiating fury. "Captain Thorne began immediately, as I was saying. Sergeant Rustova willfully disobeyed a direct order, abandoned her mission objective, and caused the termination of the entire exercise. Her actions were reckless and demonstrated a complete lack of judgment. She is a liability to this company." Captain Evans held up a hand, silencing Thorne. He looked at Eva. "Sergeant, please have a seat." Eva sat in the folding chair opposite him. "I have First Sergeant Thorne's version of events," Captain Evans said, his voice even. "Now I would like to hear yours. From the beginning, leave nothing out." Eva took a breath and began to speak. She recounted the mission briefing, the trek through the swamp, and the moment Miller fell. She described the injury in precise, clinical detail. She explained her call to Thorne and his response. She detailed his order to carry Miller to kilometers through the swamp and her decision that doing so would have endangered the soldier's life. She told him how she had switched to the emergency channel and called for a medevac on her own authority. She didn't make excuses or try to soften her insubordination. She stated the facts as they had happened. When she was finished, the tent was silent. Thorne was practically vibrating with rage, but he kept his mouth shut under the captain's stern gaze. Captain Evans steepled his fingers, his eyes fixed on Eva. "Sergeant, you understand the importance of the chain of command. You understand that disobeying a direct order in the field is one of the most serious offenses a soldier can commit." "Yes, sir, I do," Eva replied. "And you understand that First Sergeant Thorne's order, while you may have disagreed with it, was a lawful order," he continued. "Sir," Eva said, choosing her words carefully, "I believe an order that would result in the grievous harm or death of a soldier under my command, when other options are available, is not a lawful order. My primary responsibility is to the welfare of my soldiers." Thorne made a choked sound of disgust, but the captain ignored him. Captain Evans stared at her for a long, uncomfortable moment. Eva felt a drop of sweat trickle down her back. This was it. Her career was hanging by a thread, and that thread was in the hands of the man sitting across from her. Finally, the captain's radio on the table crackled to life. "Alpha Command, this is Womack Tower. Do you have a Captain Evans available?" Over. Captain Evans picked up the handset. "This is Captain Evans. Go ahead, Womack." The voice on the other end was crisp and professional. "Sir, I'm calling to follow up on the medevac you had an hour ago, the one for Specialist Miller." "I'm aware of it," the captain said, his eyes still on Eva. Double quotes. "Yes, sir. Well, the flight surgeon at Womack Army Medical Center asked me to pass along a message. He said it was urgent. He said to tell whoever the ranking NCO was on the ground with that soldier that their actions saved his leg, and very likely his life. The fracture was severe, and he was developing compartment syndrome. The surgeon said that if he had been in that swamp for another hour, he would have lost a limb, or worse, bled out internally." He called it a textbook field response to a critical trauma situation. A profound stillness filled the tent. Eva felt the air leave her lungs in a silent rush. The voice on the radio continued. "Also, sir, the pilot on that Black Hawk was Colonel Matthews. He's the base deputy commander. He was just getting in his flight hours. He wanted me to let you know that he was very impressed with the professionalism and clarity of the NCO on the radio." "Sergeant Rostova," he said. "He said it was a pleasure to see a leader take decisive action to save her people. That's all, Sir. Womack out." Captain Evans slowly placed the handset back on its cradle. He didn't look at Thorn, he looked directly at Eva, and for the first time, his expression was clear. It was not anger, it was not disappointment. It was a look of deep, profound reassessment. First Sergeant Thorn stood frozen, his face a pale, mottled mask of disbelief. The entire foundation of his argument, his entire case against Eva, had just been demolished by a flight surgeon and a full colonel. The captain leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Eva's. "Sergeant Rostova," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "It seems we have more to discuss." The silence in the command tent was so thick you could have cut it with a bayonet. First Sergeant Thorn stood as if frozen, his face a ghastly shade of white. The words of the base deputy commander, relayed over the radio, had sucked all the air out of the room and all the bluster out of Thorn. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire world crumble to dust at his feet. Captain Evans let the silence hang for a long moment, ensuring the lesson was fully absorbed. Then he turned his gaze to Thorn. His voice was quiet, yet it carried the sharp edge of a razor. "First Sergeant," he said, "you are dismissed. Go and make sure the platoon is ready to move back to the barracks. I will deal with you later." Thorn looked as if he wanted to speak, to argue, to salvage some shred of his shattered authority. But one look at the captain's unyielding expression, and the words died in his throat. He gave Eva a look of pure, undiluted hatred, a look that promised this was not over, then turned on his heel and stalked out of the tent. Captain Evans watched him go, a weary sigh escaping his lips. He turned back to Eva. "Sergeant Rostova," he began, his tone shifting from harsh to something more measured, more thoughtful. "You were right. You made a difficult call under pressure, and it was the correct one. You saved a soldier's life. You should be commended for that." He paused, leaning forward. "But I want you to understand something. You also broke the chain of command. You defied a direct order. In this case, your insubordination was justified by the outcome. 99 times out of 100, it would not have been, and a colonel wouldn't have been flying the helicopter that picked up your man. You would be facing a court-martial right now." "I understand, sir," Eva said quietly. "I hope you do," the captain said, "because you just made a very powerful enemy. First Sergeant Thorn has been in this army for 20 years. He has friends in places you don't even know exist. He will not forget what happened here today. He will be watching you, waiting for you to make the slightest mistake. When we deploy, you will not have the luxury of a flight surgeon and a colonel to back you up." The warning was clear. She had won the battle. But the war was far from over. "Your record will show that you took decisive action to save a soldier." Captain Evans continued. "There will be no formal reprimand. You will retain command of 3rd Squad, but I am telling you this for your own good, Sergeant. Watch your back." "Yes, sir," Eva said. She stood up, her body aching with exhaustion. "One more thing, Rostova," the captain said as she reached the tent flap door. She turned. "Good work," he said. There was a flicker of genuine respect in his eyes. "Now get back to your squad. They're waiting for you." When Eva stepped out of the command tent, the atmosphere in the clearing had changed. The angry, confused chatter had been replaced by a low, buzzing murmur. Thorn had evidently stomped through the crowd and given the order to pack up his face like thunder. Everyone knew he had been dressed down, and everyone knew Eva had been the cause. As she walked toward her squad, the sea of soldiers parted. Before her, the looks were different now. The pity was gone, replaced by a grudging respect. The contempt had vanished, replaced by curiosity. They were looking at her not as a woman who had failed, but as a sergeant who had stared down the most feared NCO in the company, and one. Her men from 3rd Squad were gathered by their Humvee, their faces anxious. When they saw her, a wave of relief washed over them. "Sarge," Hulk Henderson boomed, a wide grin splitting his face. "You're okay. We heard the captain was tearing you a new one." "I'm fine, Hulk," Eva said, a small smile touching her lips for the first time that day. "So, what happened?" Doc Santiago asked, his eyes searching her face. "Are you still our squad leader?" "I am," Eva confirmed. "And we are still 3rd Squad." A ragged cheer went up from her men. They crowded around her, patting her on the back, their relief and pride obvious. They had been her squad before. Now, they were her family. They had been forged into a single, unbreakable unit in the fire of that swamp. The 2 weeks leading up to their deployment passed in a blur of paperwork, training, and packing. First Sergeant Thorn was a ghost. He did his job with a cold, robotic efficiency, but he never spoke to Eva directly. He would give his orders to the platoon, his eyes sliding past her as if she didn't exist. But Eva could feel his gaze on her back when she wasn't looking. It was a cold, heavy weight that reminded her of the captain's warning. Then, one gray morning, they were gone. The green, humid world of Fort Bragg was replaced by the roar of a C-17 transport plane. 18 hours later, the ramp lowered, and they were hit by a blast of heat and light that felt like opening an oven. They were in Afghanistan. Forward. Operating base. Fob Salerno was a sprawling, dusty city of tents, containers, and sandbags, carved out of a landscape of breathtaking and brutal beauty. Jagged, brown mountains clawed at a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The air was thin and dry and tasted of dust. A fine, talcum powder-like sand got into everything: their food, their gear, their lungs. This was the real thing. There were no blank grounds here. The dangers were not simulated. Alpha Company settled into a routine, but it was a routine laced with constant underlying tension. Every day patrols went out beyond the wire, and every day, everyone held their breath until they came back. Thorne, in this new environment, seemed to reassert his authority. Here his gruff, old-school demeanor was seen by many as a sign of experience. He knew the landscape, he knew the enemy, and he knew how to stay alive. His animosity toward Eva became more subtle, but no less dangerous. He couldn't publicly humiliate her anymore, but he could use the mission roster like a weapon. Third Squad started getting the bad assignments. The midnight patrols along the most dangerous roads. The long reconnaissance missions into remote, unfriendly valleys. The hearts and minds visits to villages that were known to be sympathetic to the enemy. On paper, they were all necessary jobs, but Eva knew Thorne was giving them the missions with the highest risk, hoping that she would fail, that something would go wrong, that one of her men would get hurt or killed. He was giving her enough rope, hoping she would hang herself with it. Eva and her squad met the challenge head-on. They became more vigilant, more meticulous in their planning. Eva spent hours poring over maps and intelligence reports, trying to read between the lines, trying to anticipate the dangers Thorne was so happy to ignore in his briefings. Her squad, bonded by their experience in the swamp and their shared distrust of Thorne, operated with a quiet, focused intensity, trusted her judgment completely. Hulk Henderson, once her biggest detractor, was now her most fervent protector. Doc Santiago's .com presence was a steadying influence on them all. About a month into their deployment, the new mission came down. Thorne unrolled a map during the morning briefing. "All right, listen up. We've been getting reports of increased enemy activity in the Tangi Valley, about 20 clicks north of here. Intel suggests they may be setting up an illegal checkpoint to extort and intimidate the locals." He tapped a spot on the map. "There's a small village here, called St. Yuseft. We need a squad to go in, make contact with the village elders, and see what they know. A simple reconnaissance and atmospheric patrol. Find out what's going on, but do not engage. Just observe and report." He looked around the room, his eyes finally landing on Eva. "Third Squad, you're up. It should be a straightforward walk in the park. You'll take one Humvee, move out in 1 hour. A walk in the park." The phrase sent a chill down Eva's spine. The Tangi Valley was notoriously dangerous. It was a narrow, winding canyon with high ridges on both sides, a perfect place for an ambush, and sending a single unarmored Humvee into that area was reckless at best. After the briefing, Eva cornered Thorne near the motor pool. "First Sergeant," she said, keeping her voice low and professional, "requesting permission to take a second vehicle, an MRAP, if one is available. The Tangi Valley is a high-threat area for IEDs. A single softskin Humvee is too much of a risk." Thorne turned to her, a slow, cold smile spreading across his face. It was the first time he had smiled at her since the incident at Fort Bragg. "Can't do it, Sergeant. All our MRAPs are assigned to other patrols today. Besides," he added, his voice dripping with false concern, "I thought you were a top squad leader. A good leader should be able to handle a simple patrol without needing a rolling fortress. Don't you have confidence in your own abilities, Rostova?" It was a trap, and she knew it. If she pushed the issue, he would accuse her of being timid, of being afraid. If she accepted the mission as is, she would be putting her men in grave danger. "My confidence is not the issue, First Sergeant," she said through clenched teeth. "The safety of my men is." "Your men will be fine if you do your job right," he said, turning his back on her. "Now get your squad ready. You're burning daylight." Eva walked back to her men, her mind racing. She gathered them around. "Their Humvee, all right. Listen up," she said, her face grim. "The mission has changed. We are no longer driving into the valley. We're going to drive to the mouth of the valley, leave the vehicle in a concealed position, and proceed on foot. We'll move along the high ground, on the ridges, not the valley floor. It'll be a longer, harder walk, but it will keep us out of the kill zone. Her squad nodded without question. They trusted her. We're going in heavy, she continued. Extra ammo, extra water, extra grenades. Martinez, you're on the radio. Keep it on a tight leash. Short, coded bursts. Only, Hulk, you're on the machine gun. Doc, you know what to do. Everyone, stay sharp. My gut tells me this is not a walk in the park. 2 hours later, they were high on a ridge overlooking the Tangi Valley. The view was spectacular and terrifying. The valley floor snaked below them, a ribbon of green fields and a small, muddy river. The village of Sanguisavt was a cluster of mud brick houses nestled in a bend of the river. It looked peaceful, too peaceful, too peaceful. Eva watched the village through her binoculars. There were no children playing in the single, dusty street. No women washing clothes in the river. No old men sitting in the shade. The village was silent. It was a ghost town. I don't like this, she whispered to Doc, who was lying beside her. This is wrong. Where is everyone? Inside, maybe, Doc suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. No, Eva said, shaking her head. This feels like a trap. The village is the bait. Suddenly, Martinez, who was monitoring the radio, touched her arm. Sarge, I'm picking up chatter. It's faint. Sounds like they're using cheap, short-range radios. Can you understand it? Eva asked. Just bits and pieces, Martinez whispered. They're not speaking Pashto. It's a different dialect. But I've heard a few words over and over. Americans are high ground. And the West Pass. Ava's blood ran cold. The West Pass was behind them. It was the way they had come. She looked back the way they came, scanning the jagged rocks and sparse vegetation. Nothing, but she knew they were there. They had been watched the entire time. They had walked right into the middle of a carefully prepared ambush. Thorne hadn't just sent them on a dangerous mission. He had sent them into a kill box based on faulty or deliberately incomplete intelligence. Then, from the ridge on the opposite side of the valley, a flicker of light caught her eye. It was the sun glinting off something metal, a rifle scope. Then she saw another, and another. The entire opposing ridge was lined with them, and at the same moment, the world exploded. A deafening blast from behind them sent rock and debris flying through the air. An RPG had slammed into the rocks just above the West Pass, cutting off their only route of retreat. It was followed by the terrifying metallic chatter of machine gun fire erupting from the ridge across the valley. Bullets whizzed over their heads, chipping away at the rocks they were using for cover. From the supposedly empty village below, dozens of figures swarmed out of the houses, firing AK-47s up at their position. They were pinned down from 3 sides, outnumbered, outgunned, and with their only escape route blocked. Martinez frantically worked the radio. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Alpha 3. We are under heavy attack in the Tangi Valley. We are pinned down and taking fire from all sides. We need immediate assistance. Over. He listened for a moment, his face pale. Sarge, the radio. It's just static. I can't get through. We're out of range. Eva looked at the faces of her men, crouched behind the rocks, the thunder of gunfire all around them. She saw the fear in their eyes, but she also saw their resolve. They looked to her, their leader, their sister. They were out of range and out of options. Thorne had finally gotten his wish. He had put her in a situation she couldn't escape. But as she chambered around in her rifle and peered over the rock at the impossible odds, Eva Rostova felt not despair but a cold, hard fury. They had picked a fight with the wrong squad. The world dissolved into a storm of noise and violence. The air was thick with the crackle of automatic weapons, the deafening boom of RPGs, and the sharp, angry buzz of bullets snapping past their heads. Rock fragments and dust rained down on Third Squad, forcing them to press their faces into the hard, unforgiving ground. They were caught in a perfectly executed 3-sided ambush. It was a meat grinder. Return fire. Eva roared, her voice barely audible over the din. Short, controlled bursts. Don't waste your ammo. Hulk, get that 240 talking. Hulk. Henderson, his face a mask of grim determination, crawled to a slightly better position and unleashed a torrent of fire from his M240 machine gun. The heavy thumping of the weapon was a reassuring sound, a deep bass note in the chaotic symphony of the firefight. It forced the fighters in the village below to duck for cover, giving the rest of the squad a precious second to breathe. Martinez, keep trying that radio, Eva yelled, firing her own M4 at the muzzle flashes blinking on the opposite ridge. Try every channel. Emergency frequencies. Anything. Nothing, Sarge. Martinez shouted back, his voice tight with panic. It's all static. The mountains. are blocking us. Ava's mind raced, processing a dozen things at once. Their position was terrible. The enemy had the high ground on the opposite ridge, and their escape route was cut off. The fighters in the village below were starting to advance, moving from house to house, getting closer. They were being squeezed. They had maybe 30 minutes of ammunition if they were careful. After that, they would be overrun. This was how it ended. Thorn had finally won. He had sent them to their deaths, and no one would ever know it wasn't just bad luck. The thought filled her not with fear, but with a white-hot rage that sharpened her senses. She would not die here. Her men would not die here. "Doc, how are you doing?" she yelled. "I'm good, Sarge." Doc Santiago called back. He was huddled behind a large boulder, methodically laying out his medical supplies, just in case. His calmness was an anchor in the storm. "Everyone's still in one piece. Good. Keep your head down." Eva scanned their small patch of rocky terrain. They needed better cover. "Listen up," she commanded, her voice cutting through the noise with practiced authority. "We're going to fall back about 20 meters. There's a better position, a small rock formation that will give us more cover. We move on my command. I'll lay down covering fire with Hulk. When you get there, you cover us. Move in pairs. Go." One by one, in a desperate, crouching run, the squad members scrambled back to the new position. Eva and Hulk laid down a steady stream of fire, forcing the enemy to keep their heads down. Bullets kicked up dust around their feet as they ran. It was the longest 20 meters of their lives. Finally, it was just Eva and Hulk. "Go," Eva yelled. Hulk grabbed his machine gun and ran, his big frame surprisingly agile. Eva provided cover, emptying her magazine in a series of quick, precise shots. Then, it was her turn. She sprinted across the open ground, the air alive with the sound of angry hornets, and dove behind the rock formation, landing hard on her shoulder. They were all there, breathing heavily, hearts pounding, but they were all there. The new position was better. The rocks were thicker, offering more protection from the fire coming from the opposite ridge, but their situation was still hopeless. They were just delaying the inevitable. The enemy knew it. The firing from the village was getting closer. They were maneuvering, preparing for a final assault. Eva looked up at the vast, empty blue sky. It was so peaceful, so indifferent to the life-and-death struggle happening below. They were completely alone, out of range, and out of options. 30 miles away and 30,000 feet higher. Air Force Major Catherine O'Connell, call sign Hogwen, banked her A-10 Thunderbolt 2 into a long, lazy circle. Below her, the mountains of Afghanistan sprawled out like a crumpled brown blanket. For the past 2 hours, she had been on a routine reconnaissance patrol. It was boring work, but necessary. She was about to call it a day and head back to back airfield when a sound flickered in her headset. It was a burst of static on the emergency guard channel, a frequency that was supposed to be silent. Most pilots would have ignored it, dismissing it as atmospheric interference. But Cat O'Connell was not most pilots. She had a reputation for being meticulous, for paying attention to the little things. She was also known for having a stubborn streak a mile wide, a trait that had gotten her into trouble with her superiors more than once, but had also earned her the undying loyalty of the ground troops she supported. She adjusted her receiver, straining to listen. There it was again, faint, garbled, almost completely buried in static, but it was unmistakable. It was a voice, a human voice, speaking English, strained with desperation. "Made A Alpha 3, under heavy, Tangi Valley. Need immediate..." The transmission died. Cott's blood ran cold. Tangi Valley. She knew the place. It was a bad neighborhood, a known hornet's nest. She quickly checked her map. The valley was at the very edge of her patrol area. She tried to raise her command center at Bagram Sky King. "This is Hot One. Do you have any friendly units operating in the Tangi Valley?" Over. The reply was broken, the signal distorted by the mountains. Hog 1 negative, all units clear of. Repeat, you are to RTB, return to base. That was the order. The signal was too weak for a clear conversation. She was on her own. Protocol was clear. She was not to engage without direct orders and a clear target. She had no escort. Flying her slow-moving A-10 into a hot landing zone alone was a suicide mission. She looked down at the mountains. Somewhere down there, a group of American soldiers was fighting for their lives. They had called for help, and she was the only one who had heard them. She thought about the fresh-faced kids she saw at the chow hall on the base, boys who should have been in college, not fighting a war in this godforsaken country. She thought about the unwritten promise that every soldier, sailor, airman, and marine makes to every other. "We will never leave you behind. Screw protocol," she muttered to herself. She pushed the stick forward, and the A-10 Warthog, one of the ugliest and most beloved planes in the Air Force, dipped its nose and began to descend. Sky King, this is Hog One, she said into her radio, knowing they probably couldn't hear her clearly. I'm experiencing communications malfunctions and am diverting to investigate a possible downed aircraft. Hog One out. It was a lie, but it would give her the cover she needed. She was going in. Down on the ridge. Eva was handing out her last 2 magazines of ammunition. This is it, she said, her voice grim. Make every shot count. Aim for the center. Don't let them get close. Her men nodded, their faces pale but resolute. They were soldiers. They would fight to the last man, to the last round. They checked their gear, said their quiet prayers, and prepared to die. The gunfire from the village was getting louder, closer. They could hear shouting now. And then they heard a new sound. It wasn't the crack of an AK-47 or the boom of an RPG. It was a sound that started as a low whistle and grew into a terrifying, unearthly roar. It was the sound of something moving through the air at incredible speed. It was a sound that made the hair on Ava's arms stand on end. That every soldier on that ridge, American and enemy alike, stopped firing and looked up at the sky. A shadow fell over the valley as a dark, brutal-looking aircraft screamed over the ridge. Flying so low, it felt like Eva could have reached up and touched it. It had straight wings, 2 massive engines mounted on the tail, and a cockpit that gave it the look of a vicious, predatory insect. It was an A-10 Warthog. The plane was a thing of terrible beauty. It flew with a kind of deliberate, menacing grace. As it passed over the village, the front of the plane erupted in a torrent of fire and smoke, a sound like a giant tearing a massive sheet of canvas. Ripped through the valley. It was the sound of the A-10's 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon, a 7-barrel Gatling gun that could fire almost 4,000 rounds a minute. A stream of tracers, like angry red bees, slammed into the houses where the enemy fighters were hiding. The mud brick walls disintegrated, exploding into clouds of dust and debris. The enemy's advance stopped dead. They broke and ran, scrambling for cover from this new, terrifying angel of death that had appeared from nowhere. The A-10 pulled up sharply, its engines screaming in protest, and banked hard, coming around for another pass. This time, it targeted the machine gun nests on the opposite ridge. A series of explosions blossomed along the ridgeline as the Warthog released a volley of rockets. The enemy gunfire from that direction ceased completely. In the sudden ringing silence, Ava's radio, which had been nothing but static for the past hour, crackled to life. A woman's voice, steady, and with a slight Texas drawl, came through as clear as a bell. Alpha 3, this is Hog One. Looks like you folks are in a bit of a pickle. I'm a little low on gas and I'm not supposed to be here, so let's make this quick. Talk to me. Where do you want me to put the rain? Eva stared at the radio in her hand, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Tears of relief welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. There was no time for emotion. She keyed the mic, her voice miraculously steady. Hog One, this is Alpha 3. You have no idea how good it is to hear your voice. You are a sight for sore eyes. Glad I could make it to the party, Alpha 3, the pilot replied. Now, what do you see? Ava's training took over. She became a cold, efficient extension of the pilot in the sky. Hog One, we have enemy forces concentrated in the tree line at the base of the eastern ridge. They are preparing to regroup. Can you hit them? That's a big 10-4, Alpha 3, the pilot said. Consider them gone. Hog One is rolling in hot. The A-10 dipped a wing and dove toward the valley floor again. Eva and her squad watched, mesmerized, as the pilot performed a masterclass in close air support. The plane danced through the valley, seemingly defying physics, unleashing its devastating payload with pinpoint accuracy. The enemy, who had been on the verge of victory just minutes before, was now in a full-blown panicked retreat. For 10 minutes, the A-10 owned the Tangi Valley. It was a one-plane army, a guardian angel with a Gatling gun. Finally, the valley fell silent. The enemy was gone. The Warthog made one last, slow pass over their position, waggling its wings in a gesture of farewell. Alpha 3, the pilot's voice came over the radio. My dance card is full and I'm running on fumes. I've raised your command on a relay. They're sending a QRF to pick you up. They should be here in 20 minutes. You guys stay safe down there. Hog One, Eva said, her voice thick with emotion she could no longer suppress. We owe you everything. You saved our lives. Who are you? There was a pause, and then a chuckle. Just a taxi driver, Sergeant. Doing my job. Hog One out. The radio went silent. The A-10 climbed into the sky, becoming a small speck. and then vanished. Eva and her squad stood up, looking at each other in stunned disbelief. They were covered in dirt, their ears were ringing, but they were alive. They had been to the edge of the abyss and had been pulled back by a pilot who had broken every rule in the book to save them. A pilot who hadn't waited for an escort, a pilot who had dropped in low and faced the fire alone. A woman, just like her, who had simply refused to let them die.